Greetings. We are several weeks into summer now, and I have been hard at work on my GT6 project. I will provide an update on that work soon enough, but in the short term, I'm going to continue with some of the more Spitfire-oriented content that I have been working on, including this oddball video coming up. So I'm going to start this short episode with something that I threatened previously, and that's a little bit of story time in the form of a reading of the first essay that I published on my Triumph Spitfire. First, though, let me provide a little bit of background information. So this is an essay that I originally wrote when I was a graduate student while I was working on my dissertation. And I sent the original version of this essay to British Car magazine in 2002, probably with delusions of grandeur. The editor of British Car magazine, Gary Anderson, was extremely gracious and encouraging. I had a really nice exchange with him. But he said he was only interested in the piece if I cut it down significantly, that there was only so much room in the magazine for a guest column type piece. And I ultimately declined and decided to hold on to the piece and try to do something else with it later on. In the meantime, Spitfire and GT6 magazine had really grown significantly from its humble origins. And so I held on to the piece for a while, ended up reworking it and sending it to Spitfire and GT6 magazine in 2004. And it was published in the fall 2004 issue. And I was really grateful to have that outlet. And I was sending it to a Spitfire story, and I was sending it to kind of a dedicated Spitfire audience, so I felt good about that. Unfortunately, and this is the English professor in me, but unfortunately, I actually had made a few relatively minor but careless errors in the manuscript that were not caught in the editing process. And then also, the magazine introduced some errors into my manuscript, mainly by changing all of the M-dashes in my manuscript into hyphens in the published version of the piece, which really negatively impacts readability and looks weird. But anyway, it is what it is. And as I said, it's really grateful to have that outlet. The slideshow I'm going to show during my reading of the essay involves a series of photos of my Spitfire from over the years, going back to my earliest days with the car in 1991 through to the present. Actually, it was quite a trip down memory lane looking for these photos and putting the slideshow together. For one relatively trivial example, I had forgotten how I had periodically changed the vanity plate on the front of the car over the years. In the earliest days, I had a British flag, a Union Jack plate on the car, and then at some point I swapped that out for a blue Triumph plate with the Griffin Wings book shield logo on it. And then at some point I swapped that out for a white dealership style Spitfire plate with the RAF roundel or bullseye logo on it. And then more recently I swapped that out for a black plate with the Triumph floral wreath logo on it. But anyway, just a minor detail that I was reminded of as I went through photos. As I was working things up, I became aware that I don't think I've ever really shown my car in full on the channel previously. So at the end of the slideshow, I have about a 1 minute driveway walk around of the car. This is kind of an experiment. I hope at least two or three of you out there enjoy this or get some amusement out of it. Here goes. It's always difficult to trace it back, to get at the history of it, to know how these things begin. It usually starts with something small, a memory, the curve of a fender, the rumble of an engine, some feature that brings a sinister grin to the face of a budding shade tree mechanic and boy racer. What I can say for sure is that through a strange and difficult path, after a number of trials and tribulations in my early experiences with the automotive world, I found myself driving a 1980 Triumph Spitfire. A four-wheel ghost from the not-too-distant past, the Spitfire is white with thin silver and black dealer-applied pinstripes accenting the lines of the car. White wasn't my color of choice. When searching the market for a little British sports car, my preference was naturally British racing green, images of D-types from days of yore dancing in my head. But when a cash-strapped car enthusiast goes on an acquisition quest, he always feels compelled to take the best car he can find, regardless of the details. As the car I found was bathed in white paint at the factory, it will continue to wear a white coat as long as I am its keeper, which will be as long as I'm around. The bookends of the car are the chunky black plastic bumper covers that were used in the final months of Spitfire production to comply with U.S. regulations. Over the years, I've noticed that some people retrofit earlier chrome bumpers to their 79.5 and 80 cars because they are lighter and generally thought to be prettier, but I have no intention of doing so. The plastic monstrosities are an important monument to the end of a sports car era, and I keep them the way someone buys and keeps the latest awful album by a once great but now faded rock and roll act, if only to round out the collection. The Spitfire is much more than transportation, although I'm merely stating the obvious. When I tug on the choke and twist the key, the car shudders and shakes and comes to life. The joys of driving the Spitfire are only tempered by the fact that I have to keep a careful eye on the gauges. The car is British, after all. Gripping the steering wheel, stomping the pedals, and stirring the gearbox, I find that work and other mundane matters barely haunt me at all. Often enough, the radio is off because music seems superfluous. I listen to the whipping wind accompanying the rumbling exhaust and take in the scenery. On roads jammed with Leviathan-sized SUVs, people often stare strangely at the rolling anachronism I drive. These days, it's rare that I pass another little sports car of the same stature, unless it's one of the new ones, which aren't the same at all, try as they might. The Spitfire was a little over a decade old when I took it in. It was my daily driver for about 7 years, beginning when I was 19 and commuting to college. Because I live in a place where the winters are mild, never did I have to go for an extended period of time not driving my car for fear that a white wintry blanket would make conditions undrivable, or have to worry about salt water licking the bottom of my car until the whole thing melted into a pile of brownish red dust. Instead of long winters of motoring discontent, 70-degree December and January days were always perfect excuses to drop the top and take the long way home. As might be expected in such an important long-term relationship, the car is bound up in a flood of memories. When I was driving my car almost every day while commuting to college, I particularly loved the fall. During this season, I often found myself speeding home in the afternoon through natural tunnels formed by bowing tree limbs, the roads littered with flying leaves of various colors, the smell of burning wood from roadside homes hanging in the air, my radio tuned to some AM sports station on which people taunted each other about the coming weekend's big college football games. Many evenings I enjoyed driving into the pink-orange sunset, the sinking sun melting into the reflecting fender of the car as the day flared out. Other times were less ideal, such as Arctic winter mornings when the car rarely started without a shot of starter fluid, and even when the engine was warm, the heater fought far too gently against the invading cold. A few weeks of this made me wish for spring, when the weather turned warm and the driving experience was enhanced by the smell of fresh-cut grass and honeysuckle, but the pollen makes life difficult, and then the summer can be unbearably hot. Still, I drove the car throughout the year, racking up the miles, and I enjoyed it, gaining the full experience of every season. The car and all that comes with it are a passion as complicated as any worthwhile thing in life, but is something I learned well. It was my good fortune to be the son of a gearhead who surrounded me with all the trappings of life in the automotive world, and yet never put any pressure on me to get involved with them. This seems to have ensured that my conversion would be gradual but complete. I grew up pretend driving my father's 1969 GT6 Plus. I'd sit in the driver's seat and imagine that I was speeding along the highway, even though no matter how much I strained, I could only see the bottom of the dash and had an incredibly good view of the pedals that I could not reach. My father sold that car when I was still quite young. Something about the driver of a station wagon who thought he or she had found an empty parking space, and my father's frustration and dissatisfaction with the necessity of seemingly endless amounts of body filler on what was once a perfectly shapely sports car. When I was 19 and in need of a commuter car for college, I decided to go British out of an impulse born of faint but important memories, thinking back to my father's by then long gone GT6 or my uncle's TR6, which he'd even more recently sold. I carried vague memories of going to a sports car dealer in Columbia, South Carolina around 1980 with my mother and father and looking at the Triumph Spitfires, TR7s and 8s and MGBs. I couldn't then have known that they were a dying breed, and while I had the average boy's fascination with cars that included a sizable Matchbox car collection, at the time I couldn't have cared less. After all, there were Star Wars toys to play with and footballs to kick. And then, as the years of my life accumulated, the future brought one of the most powerful and common cliches of the automotive experience. By the time I was 19, there was nostalgia. It seemed like something was being lost forever, something that I needed to experience for myself. So over a decade later, I owned my own British sports car. Within a short period of time, I had spent countless hours learning how to do things from routine maintenance to rebuilding the brake master cylinder to putting new bearings in the transmission. My father, usually by my side, showing me things, teasing me, taking over from time to time. I learned things and my knowledge grew. You really do get used to doing things like pulling out all of the interior to get to the transmission so much that it becomes routine. And it's nice to know things like exactly which bolts and screws are a pain to get started and which aren't, which is to say that it's nice to really know your car. This information prepares the daredevil pilot of a British rattletrap for a variety of malfunctions, the annoying little problems that lead to bleeding knuckles and creative cursing, the dark side of the sport that we know too well. I vividly remember reaching heights of aggravation during the difficult times, usually involving broken or worn out bits and pieces, the transmission, the clutch, the alternator, a water pump, the differential. Along with the motoring fun, I distinctly recall the times during my college days when a week's worth of work on the car saw me going to school on cold, dim mornings riding my motorcycle or driving one of my parents' cars, or at the very end of the task at hand, driving my car with no interior but the transmission tunnel bolted in tightly and a single seat bolted to a naked floor pan. Needless to say, much of the money I earned at my part-time job in a grocery store was spent on parts. Which brings me back to the humming engine. The reason that humming sound is so satisfying is because I made it so. This is the most basic principle behind the thing, the binding of man and machine, the reciprocal relationship between the maintainer and the maintained. I drive and drive intently listening. How some people can live in ignorance of the inner workings of their cars is beyond my foolishly romantic notions of what driving sports cars is all about. From all of this, over a decade of wrenching and driving a little British sports car, enduring life lessons have come. Something will go wrong when you least expect it. You'll need help doing something the most when no one else is around. Always keep sunscreen in a convertible and always wear it when the top is down. 15 years on, the Spitfire's paint is worn thin. There are dents and dings and rusty spots. A few bits of sheet metal need replacing, and an engine rebuild will be in order sooner than later. When the time comes, it is work I will undertake with no effort or expense spared, for there is a value to the thing far greater than the sum of its parts. There are things I would do differently if I were writing that essay today. There are a few little details that bother me. Content-wise, one thing that I should reference is that in the brief story about my father's GT6, which is now my GT6, in the essay, I conflated some details in the backstory when I wrote that essay. But nevertheless, the essay does capture the spirit of my history with my Spitfire. And 20 years later, the sentiments still very much ring true. All this reflection on the past leads me to want to bring up one other thing in this short video. and that is the importance to me of an old local establishment known as Columbia Sports Car Garage. The proprietor passed away several years ago, and he was quite the character. Lots of folks who were involved in the British sports car scene in the Midlands area of South Carolina in the last handful of decades have stories about him. And I'll note that the business in Columbia Sports Car Garage form seems to have come to a rather ignominious end. If a Google search I did one summer when I returned home from grad school and found the place essentially shuttered is accurate. But I'm not interested in dwelling on any of that. I really want to just take a moment to express appreciation and gratitude for the existence of the place and how it helped me as a young, budding British sports car enthusiast. My early years with the Spitfire in particular, when I was kind of vetting it and making it a daily driver, would have been much more frustrating if not for the existence of that place. And I'll explain that in a bit of detail in a moment. The place is still there, shadow of its former self, ravaged by neglect and time. A scene that really reminds me of James Dickey's poem, Cherry Log Road. You see, the business featured a huge boneyard of MGs, Triumphs, and other British cars. As I was sorting the Spitfire in the early years to make it a daily driver, I had to replace all kinds of things, so I bought quite a few new and used parts from the place. I was treated very kindly, too, especially for a young, long-haired, grungy kid who was really just starting to learn about cars. Early on, there was, as I recall, a grizzled mechanic / sports car racer at the counter. I believe his name was Sid, who would look at my broken part, disappear into the boneyard, and eventually emerge with a good used version of the part I needed. Of course, Columbia Sports Car Garage was important for aesthetic things too, especially as my car had a nasty habit of periodically throwing off a factory wheel trim ring, and I would pop on over and get a replacement. Also collected a few old accessory trinkets from the counter area, including this Spitfire item. Not sure whether this clip type key fob was an original factory accessory or a later aftermarket item, but I think I've seen one exactly like it elsewhere. The owner's son was always very kind to me too. He was very friendly when I saw him, and he even invited me into the shop at one point to look at a car they were restoring. I think I last saw him at some point in the late 1990s. I was driving the Spitfire with the hardtop on it, and I had stopped at a gas station not too far from my parents' house, and he just happened to be there. I think maybe he was gassing up a boat. And he came over to me and we chatted for a bit, and I remember he told me how pretty he thought Spitfires are with the hardtops on. It's just a chance encounter a long time ago, and quite confident that was the last time I saw him. For whatever little bit it's worth on this teeny tiny little YouTube channel, I wanted to take a second to pay respect to the establishment, to give it and some of the people there their due in my own little personal history. I can also lament the fact that the property in its current condition probably still has a few valuable treasures out there among the shells and carcasses going to waste. It's a lamentable situation of a type occurring here and there across the land, and one symbolic of a variety of things we try not to dwell on too much. And that's all for this episode. I hope to be back again soon. Take care.